Welcome back students. In this second video, I shall proceed from where I left last time. We will continue with chapter 1, that is Indian economy on the eve of independence. And since we have already thrown light on agriculture sector and industrial sector, so today we shall proceed with rest of the sectors of the economy. So first of all, I am going to talk about foreign trade during that time. Children, when we talk about foreign trade, so India has been an important trading nation since ancient time. But with the advent of Britishers, the policies which Britishers had pursued that affected our structure, composition and direction of foreign trade. When we talk about structure and composition of trade, basically we are talking about the kind of items India was exporting and importing. When it comes to direction, we are talking about which all nations India was having trade with. If we talk about the composition, then India was basically exporting primary products such as raw silk, cotton, wool, sugar, indigo, etc. And it was importing finished consumer goods like cotton, silk, woolen cloths and capital goods like light machinery, and they were produced in the factories of Britain. So it is quite evident the Britishers, they were actually exporting primary products so that raw material was made available for British industries, and we were serving as a market for British produced goods. Now, when we talk about the direction, children, Britain maintained a monopoly over export and imports. So, more than half of Indian foreign trade was actually happening with Britain only. There was hardly any trade with other nations except China, Sri Lanka and Iran. Another very important aspect regarding foreign trade is that there was generation of export surplus. Now that means our exports were much higher than our imports during that time, and since we have already talked about what India was exporting primary products, so we were able to generate a surplus. ठीक है, हमारा export जो था वो ज़्यादा था, लेकिन this came at a huge cost or scarcity of essential commodities. Children, I would like to talk about commercialization of agriculture, which we have already talked about in the first video. Now, what happens is when Britishers were, in a way encouraging farmers to produce more of cash crops. So, when farming or agriculture was commercialized, and since I told you if a farmer is having limited resources, and now instead of producing food crops, he is actually producing cash crops. So, obviously, it will lead to scarcity of essential items of food grain, etc. And that is what it was exactly happening during that time. Now, another thing is, although this is a good thing that we were generating export surplus, but this did not result in any form of gold or silver inflow in our country. Rather, whatever Britishers were able to generate out of that, it was causing drain of Indian wealth. That drain of Indian wealth, we use this phrase because whatever export surplus was generated, now that was actually being spent on the improvement, or you can say that was being spent by British government for making payment for British offices which was set up in Britain. So that wealth was not utilized for India at all. That is why we call it drain of, it was leading to drain of Indian wealth. We also can see that since Britishers were fighting wars, and for that also they needed money. So this generation of export surplus and whatever resultant wealth they were able to create out of this, that was used for fighting wars by British government. And they were also importing invisible items. Now, what are invisible items? Basically, it is referring to trade in services. So, they were importing services from Britain, and for that also they were making payment out of this only. Now, the next thing we are going to talk about is demographic profile or demographic condition during that time. Now, children, the word demography, what is the meaning of this word? Whenever we are talking about characteristics of population, then we are referring to demographic profile. Now, it's interesting to note that during that time, and since we know that we collect the information about the population via census, so the first census was conducted during British time, colonial rule, in the year 1881. And we would also like, I would also like to tell you that India entered the second phase of demographic transition in the year 1921. This is a very important year. Now, let me tell you what is this theory of demographic transition, or what is the second phase, the second stage of demographic transition. Now, children, what happens if you see in the demographic transition, in the first stage, the birth rate of the country, of the population, the birth rate remains very high, and death rate is also very high. So, as a result, the growth of population remains very low. Now, when a nation enters the second stage, now what is the characteristic of the second stage of demographic transition? In the second stage, although birth rate remains high, because it takes a long time to bring down the birth rate. Why so? Because birth rate is not just dependent upon economic factors, it is dependent on many social factors as well. And social outlook, the thinking of the people, that takes a long time to change, or it's to see a transition in that, it takes a very long time. So, obviously, in the second stage also the birth rate remains very high, but yes, death rate began to fall. Now, why does death rate fall? Because there is improvement in sanitation, there is improvement in public health facilities, modernization happening in the medical field. Many diseases which were earlier uncurable, we were able to find a cure for that. So, as a result of all these factors, what will happen? The death rate will come down drastically. Now, high birth rate and low death rate. What will be the result? Very high growth of population. And so, India entered that stage in the year 1921. That means we witnessed that death rate had significantly started to fall. Now, when we talk about the literacy rate also, because it's very important when you're talking about the characteristics of the population, we should talk about education, we should talk about their health status also. So, if we look at the overall literacy rate during that time, children, it was merely 16%. And out of that, if you talk about female literacy rate, that was negligible, low at 7%. At present, if you see, according to census 2011, the present overall literacy rate is around 74.04%. If we look at the access to public health facility, so obviously there was scarcity, there was shortage, water and airborne diseases were also widespread because of lack of sanitation facilities. The mortality rate was very high, and particularly when we talk about infant mortality rate, that means number of children dying before completing 1 year of age, and this is always calculated per 1000 live births. So, it was 218 per 1000 that particular time. At present, it is around 44 per 1000. If you talk about life expectancy, during that time it was around 44 years, and in present time, as per HDI, latest HDI, it is that is Human Development Report, it is 69 years. And if we talk about poverty, although there are no such estimates available, but it cannot be doubted that there was extensive and rampant poverty during that time. Let us talk about occupational structure now. As the word suggests, occupation, that means what a person is doing. Structure made up of primary, secondary and tertiary sector. So, in a way, how do we define it? Distribution of working population across different sectors. That means how many people were engaged in agriculture, what percentage was engaged in manufacturing and services sector. Now, during that particular time, we could see that 70 to 75% of the working population was engaged in agriculture and allied activities, and 10% was engaged in manufacturing, and around 15 to 20% was engaged in service sector. So, you can see it was manufacturing sector which was absorbing the least population, working population. Another important aspect is regional variation, children. Now, regional variation means when we are talking about different regions or different states, we could see a different trend. Now, when we talk about states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Karnataka, Bombay and Bengal, they witnessed a decline in the dependence of workforce on the agriculture sector. So, people were moving away from agriculture sector to manufacturing and services sector. But if we talk about states like Orissa, Rajasthan and Punjab, we could see there was increase in the share of workforce in agriculture during the same time. Now, let's talk about infrastructure. Now, if we see, this is the only sector where we can see some positive impact or positive development which took place during British rule. But we must mention that motive behind this infrastructure development was actually to serve colonial interest. We can say infrastructure is actually a kind of support system. It supports the major areas of or major sectors of the economy, and like railways, port, water transport, post, telegraph, etc. These supporting services did develop during British rule, but let's take example of roads. So roads, the real motive behind development of road was not to bring about development of Indian economy, rather British wanted to serve their own interest, because the roads which were there during that time, they were not fit for modern transport. So where will they run their modern vehicles? So they had to develop roads. Another thing, since they were still engaged in fighting wars with many other nations, so they had to for quick mobilization of army, ठीक है, ताकि वॉर लाइक सिचुएशन में जल्दी से आर्मी जो है वो वॉर फ्रंट पे पहुंच सके, उसके लिए भी कनेक्टिविटी चाहिए थी. दैट इज़ वाई दे हैड टू बिल्ड रोड्स. Another important thing, since we have already talked about commercialization, now that production is there, how will it be sent to to Britain? So they had to draw out raw material from countryside. हर जगह से raw material को इकट्ठा करना, उसके लिए भी उनको रोड का एक्सेस और रेलवेज चाहिए था. They did develop inland trade and sea lanes. उन्होंने inland trade भी develop किया, but that turned out to be very uneconomical decision. Uneconomical यानी economic terms में वो इतना viable decision नहीं था. कैसे? जैसे अगर उन्होंने we can give here an example of coast canal on the Orissa coast. Now this canal was built at a huge cost to government, but it failed to compete with the railways. So obviously people would prefer railways rather than this canal for transportation. Another important thing, the most significant contribution that Britishers had actually made, that was railways. Railways was introduced in 1850, and the first passenger train in India ran between Bombay and Thane on 16th April 1853. Now children, due to introduction of railway, we could see that there were some social benefits also, but there was economic losses also. Why so? Because basically railways had two impacts. First, breaking geographical and cultural barriers. Now what do we mean by that? Obviously, breaking geographical barrier here means that people will be able to undertake long distance travel. So where they will be able to go places, and that will break the geographical barrier. How will it break cultural barrier now? Because if you are able to travel, you are able to come across and meet people from other states, other cultures. So when you will get knowledge about their culture, when you will develop affinity with them, then only you will start respecting their culture. So whatever barrier in the terms of mindset was there, that will gradually break down. So that was social benefit due to introduction of railways. But when we talk about economic terms, then railway also fostered commercialization of agriculture. यानी रेलवे की इंट्रोडक्शन के बाद तो कमर्शलाइजेशन और ज़्यादा बढ़ गया. ऐसा क्यों? क्योंकि भाई अब तो उनके पास फास्ट मीन्स अवेलेबल है ताकि रॉ मटेरियल को वो कंट्री साइड से एक्सट्रैक्ट कर सकते हैं. तो इसीलिए उन्होंने कमर्शलाइज और कर दिया एग्रीकल्चर को, एंड दे एनकरेज प्रोडक्शन ऑफ कैश क्रॉप्स, क्योंकि अब तो और भी फास्ट मीन्स से उसको हम वो ले जा सकते थे. तो in turn, when we see जो सोशल बेनिफिट्स थे रेलवेज के उसको आउटवे कर दिया इकोनॉमिक लॉसेस ने. तो नेट टर्म्स में हम देखें तो हमें उसका इकोनॉमिक डिसएडवांटेज ही हुआ. Another infrastructure development that we talk about is post and telegraph. So telegraph, electric telegraph which was introduced for maintenance of law and order, ताकि जो भी उनके orders हैं, whatever information they want to convey, that should quickly reach the other states also. It was introduced, but it was very expensive. And another thing was postal services, which were definitely serving a purpose, public purpose, but then they were very inadequate. यानी वो इतनी sufficient नहीं थे. Now children, let's just conclude. So basically after reading this chapter, we have come across what were the challenges Indian economy was facing on the eve of independence, that means when Britishers left us in the year 1947. First of all, let's talk about agriculture sector. So it was saddled with surplus labor and extremely low productivity. We have already seen that there was stagnation in agriculture sector, and approximately 75% of percentage of workforce was engaged in agriculture. तो already agriculture में surplus labor engaged था, जिसको or that also resulted in disguised unemployment. Now when we talk about industrial sector, it was crying for modernization, diversification, capacity building and increased public investment. We have already talked about this, that the modern industries which began to take root in India, their growth was very limited. Diversification means having variety of industries, but basically what we were having, hardly any capital good industry except TISCO, that was also incorporated in 1907. And but otherwise we saw mainly cotton and jute textile mills were there. So we did not have variety of industry, so diversification was not there. Increased public investment was needed, because we have already pointed this out, that public investment was very low in industrial sector. Now when we talk about foreign trade, what was happening there? It was oriented to feed the industrial revolution in Britain. That means, as I've already told you, most of the trade was happening with Britain only, and we were actually serving as exporter of raw material for their industries only. When we talk about infrastructure facilities, although they had developed railways, but still it needed upgradation, and public orientation means more investment in infrastructure by government was needed. There was rampant poverty and there was unemployment during that particular time. So with this we come to an end to this chapter, and I hope you have understood this chapter. Okay, thank you.